Long videos are great, right? There's nothing quite like losing yourself in some huge 3-hour long exploration of a subject you had no idea could be as deep as it is. It's that exact sweet spot where I want my lengthy retrospective series to sit. But if I'm totally honest with you, as much as I love making these videos, there's a pretty major downside to them. They are a huge amount of work to write, record and edit, which not only restricts the number of videos I can produce, but also means I have to be really choosy about the series or games that I cover. On top of this, the YouTube algorithm has a pretty nasty tendency to dislike anything off-brand, which means this channel is pretty much locked onto the path of multi-hour eulogies about the golden age of gaming. Now, that's totally fine by me. I love making these videos. But for a long time, I've also wanted a space to be able to talk about games that don't fit perfectly into that series, or to create videos with a slightly less detailed and more personal approach. So today I'm launching a new series, Quickfire Retrospectives, which is obviously still pretty damn long, but is going to allow me to talk about games that I think are interesting without feeling like I have to cover every base. It's the perfect place to cover titles that might have already had the lengthy retrospective treatment from another channel, or just don't really warrant 3 hours of analysis and 2 months of my life to create. I hope you find this self-indulgent project as interesting as I found it cathartic to produce, and hopefully it'll be the first of many Quickfire retrospectives to come. So without much further ado, let's take a look at the first one. Halo is such a funny series because for most younger gamers, I can imagine there's this confusion about just what all the fuss is about. It's a big AAA series for sure, but compared to League of Legends or Fortnite or Minecraft, it's pretty much a mainstream irrelevance now, and most of the attention it gets is from older people like myself complaining that it's just not the same anymore. Well, at the risk of becoming the embodiment of the cliché, Halo just isn't the same anymore. And I think in a strange way, it's had the effect of elevating my already high opinion of those classic Bungie titles. It's hard to overstate just what a big deal Halo 1 and 2 were in the mid-2000s. The first single-handedly codified how FPS games should play on consoles, and was basically entirely responsible for the Xbox managing to carve out a place in the industry. Halo 2 might not have been quite as influential, but the role it played in making Xbox Live something that normal people signed up for really can't be understated. I used to go round to a friend's house who had broadband, and the fact that we were playing against people all over the world was mind-blowing. That had previously been the domain of the complex and demanding world of PC gaming, and here it was, accessible with just a few button presses. While all that made the franchise into a major blockbuster, I was always most entranced by its storytelling chops. It wasn't just a mindless shooter, and it felt like the writers at Bungie were really invested in trying to craft their own original universe. It was obviously hugely influenced by Alien, Warhammer 40k and old school sci-fi novels, but it had its own original ideas. That twist in Halo 1, where you discover that the rings are actually weapons designed to destroy the life-consuming flood, that is an underrated video game moment, and brought a level of cinematic depth to a story that people thought was just going to be a rehash of Starship Troopers. Similarly, while a lot of people didn't enjoy Halo 2's refocus on delving into the Alien Covenant's political and cultural wars, I loved that Bungie wanted to take their horror war story and turn it into a full-fledged space opera. So anyway, Halo 3 was supposed to be the end of the trilogy, the final chapter in the story of Master Chief and humanity's battle against the Covenant. I don't know if it was just that I was at the perfect age, but it felt like the marketing behind this release elevated the hype to a level I've never seen since. There were ads on TV with insane production value, news reports about how big the release day was going to be, and posters plastered all over the world, all with that iconic tagline, "Finish the fight." Now this has obviously happened many times since, and the growth of the internet has only increased how often we see the major hype machines spin into action. But what makes Halo 3 different is that it genuinely lived up to this insane attention, and it marks possibly the last time I remember being ludicrously excited for a game, and then it actually delivering on that promise. The story was a lot more simplistic than the complex alien religious civil war that we'd been introduced to in Halo 2, and honestly I think that's perfectly fine. It's the satisfying third act, and it's focused entirely on resolution rather than introducing anything new. Where the narrative really succeeds is in delivering endless awesome set-piece moments one after the other. Seeing an infected flood ship crashing onto the Earth, stepping out onto the Ark at the edges of the galaxy, and the climactic sandbox battle against 2 Scarab tanks. It's just full of ludicrously memorable moments. Considering that most FPS games before this involved battling through corridor after endless similar corridor, it was like watching a high-budget sci-fi movie. I've also always loved how the final moments of the game play out. The last level is basically a complete throwback to locations and gameplay beats from the very first game, and it gives this final part of the trilogy a real sense of finality. Nowadays anything remotely successful is just drawn out over and over again, but in 2005 there was still this sense of artistry. It felt like Bungie really was trying to end the Halo story, and that just made these final moments all the more captivating. Now while the story was obviously the main draw for me, what gave Halo 3 such incredible legs was just how much content was stuffed into its single disc. AAA games are becoming more and more feature-light with every passing generation. Unlockables have been converted into DLC, extra modes are now gated behind seasonal battle passes, and fun little side activities are far too expensive to develop when deadlines are tighter than ever. It just makes Halo 3 all the more impressive to look back on. The campaign was fully playable in split screen and had this great arcade mode where you competed to get the highest scores. There were secret skulls to find which unlocked gameplay modifiers, and the multiplayer portion was so large that it's hard to believe that this used to be the gold standard for online console games. I sank so many hours into ranked duos, practicing strats and learning weapon respawn times, but it wasn't just all e-gaming seriousness. Halo 3's multiplayer was fun. There was big team battle, infection and rocket race. All funnier, less serious modes that kept you logging on when the ranked combat became a grind. It was an outrageously feature-rich game, and that's without even discussing the comprehensive Forge mode, which let you make your own game types, and where I spent so many evenings crying with laughter at stupid maps and modes that we downloaded to try out. It could well be my teenage nostalgia talking, but it felt special. Something that you looked forward to when you got home from school or college, which is a feeling that I rarely get from multiplayer games these days. A cynic might say that's because you've grown up and the glow of playing games online has become dull. But to paraphrase that cliche, they just don't make them like this anymore, and I feel like if AAA games were to return to this level of storytelling ambition and sheer content scope, well, I'd be just as excited as I was back then. My final bit of nostalgic yearning comes from the effect that Halo 3 had on YouTube. Series like RB and the Chief and Red vs Blue exploded in popularity around this time, and watching them on a streaming video platform, away from a TV set in the fledgling world of the internet, genuinely felt like the dawning of a new age. Both series started out extremely simple, basically just recording funny clips in the game and putting voiceovers in afterwards. But as they grew more popular and their creators grew more creative, they transformed into outrageously ambitious endeavours, with complex storylines, twists and surprises, and some genuine commentary about not just the video game industry but life itself. They might seem kind of dated by modern standards, but they're really representative of a pure and beautiful time on the website, where people created videos because they had stories to tell and original ideas, rather than because they wanted to start a side hustle or become an influencer. I still return to these videos all the time, and while they always lift my mood, they're also tinged with a sense of sadness for what this place used to be like. And honestly, I have that same feeling about the Halo series and the industry that it grew out of. When we say Halo isn't what it used to be, what we really mean is the video game industry isn't what it used to be. And I dearly miss those days. Before you had to be suspicious of reviews, before early access, before battle passes and microtransactions, when developers had stories to tell and boundaries to push. So while the last game was notable for the effect it had on me as a teenager, this one is special because of how it changed me as an adult. The funny thing is, I've actually owned a copy of Silent Hill 2 almost since the day it was released. I picked it up second hand, and me and my friends used to take turns seeing how far we could get before terror overtook us. Despite my obvious tough guy exterior, that usually never lasted very long, and thanks to that, I'd really not seen much of the game past the hospital level. That changed a few years ago when I decided to stream the entire series, and while I enjoyed the first game quite a lot, I was not remotely prepared for the rollercoaster of emotions that Silent Hill 2 would take me on. The first thing to discuss is that as a survival horror experience, I think Silent Hill 2 is really pretty terrible. It's really not very challenging in my opinion, as you can run past most of the enemies, and it's pretty easy to stunlock the ones you can't. You'll rarely find yourself coming into any kind of danger, which is usually a criminal offence in a genre trying to make the player fear for their lives. Where Silent Hill 2 abandons challenge, it instead offers the most exquisite atmosphere that I've ever seen in a video game, and a story that's so masterfully told through its manipulation of your expectations that it deserves to be held up as one of the finest achievements in the entire medium. Unlike its zombie and dinosaur-filled contemporaries, Silent Hill 2 is a psychological experience grounded in real life. We play as James Sunderland, who receives a letter from his wife Mary, telling him to come and meet her in their special place, the town of Silent Hill. It sounds like an innocent enough way to start a horror game, except for the fact that Mary died of an unnamed sickness 3 years ago. James, questioning his sanity, arrives at the mist-veiled town, and we set off into its streets to try and work out what exactly is happening to him. Now obviously the game has become iconic thanks to its monster design, with James's journey haunted by mutilated mannequin legs, sexually suggestive killer nurses, and a certain particularly famous triangle-helmed brute. What makes all this so much more interesting than your average gruesome monster design is that everything in the game represents specific elements of James' psyche, and as we slowly uncover the backstory behind his relationship with his wife, these creatures become so much more than just obstacles to avoid. In fact, almost every aspect of the game is tied into this central narrative. The way the levels are designed represents elements of James' fractured mental state. Locations you visit reveal nuance about his past, and conversations you have with the game's handful of NPCs are vague in that beautiful way that invites speculation rather than confusion. Its very best moment, and I think the finest level in all horror gaming, is the Silent Hill Historical Society, which is where the game finally descends into madness, but without a single line of dialogue spoken. James's journey takes him deeper and deeper into the earth, down corridors and stairways that can't possibly exist, solving cryptic puzzles that have no explanation for their being, and encountering characters that finally fray that last hold on his sanity. What's particularly brilliant about Silent Hill 2 though, is that it's not just unrelenting intensity. There are moments of calm where you're left to ponder on everything you've seen. Of course, thanks to the very nature of the game, you'll always be on the edge of your seat, but it's an incredible example of how simple restraint can elevate the atmosphere. At the very start of the game, it takes an absolute age for you to encounter your first enemy, but that won't stop you from creeping around every corner, terrified of imagined foes, and inadvertently playing the role of a scared and desperate widower. So it's impossible to truly explain why this game had such an impact on me without talking about its ending. So if you haven't played it yet, this is your warning. Immediately go and rectify that situation, and then come back and listen to me wax lyrical. In the final moments of the game, James reaches the hotel room where he and Mary spent their most cherished moments, and all of his delusions finally come crashing down. There was no letter from Mary. There was no monstrous pyramid head chasing him, and it's debatable if the other people he's met even existed. James had been playing out a lie in order to deal with the grief caused by the horrible fact that he euthanized Mary when she was terminally ill. The villain isn't some otherworldly monster or power, but the man we've been playing as. What makes this moment so good is that Team Silent actually go a step further than you would expect. This isn't a simple story of a terrible person fleeing their guilt, and ends with a recontextualization via Mary Sunderland reading her actual final letter. You see, her terminal diagnosis destroyed their relationship, and as she became more unwell, she became more and more bitter with the world, and took this out on the only person who she could. James became the focus of all of her rage, with the sheer injustice of her life being cut short, pushing them apart, but also locking them together. For James, this woman who he adored transformed into a symbol of everything going wrong in his life. His depression, his lack of power to do anything, his sexual frustration, and his isolation from those around him. By the time he decides to euthanize Mary, these two people were already dead. Their blissful life cruelly ruined by the awful lottery of sickness. And yet despite this, the game ends on a touching note. Mary tells James that he truly made her happy, and that despite their lives ending in that most awful way, she wants him to carry on and try and live a good life. It's an incredible moment that throws the entire plot into question. Did James do it because he wanted to be free of Mary, unable to bear the burden of her illness anymore? Or did he do it out of mercy, knowing that the woman he loved had already gone? It's not clear, and it's not meant to be clear. That horrible fate of two people happily living their lives is the true horror of Silent Hill 2. Not the monsters or the darkened rooms or the mind-bending levels, but a story about how, no matter how happy you are, sickness and death are always out of your control and can transform even the most pleasant dream into a nightmare. When the credits rolled, I sat there absolutely stunned. I'd never seen anything so horrifying in my entire life. Something that I could actually relate to and imagine myself in those shoes. What would happen to my mind as sickness took the ones that I love away from me? It is without a doubt the scariest game that I've ever played in my entire life, and it does it all with just a misty town and a terrible tale of ruined relationships. In a way, I think it's sad that Silent Hill 2 has become defined by its monsters, because it's so much more than that. It's a deeply personal story that deals with some huge ethical questions, which just makes it so odd to see Pyramid Head racing around in Dead by Daylight, or paraded about like a simple slasher monster in film adaptations. He's part of a bigger whole, and taken away from the cruel tale of James Sunderland's guilt, I don't think he's remotely as intimidating or interesting. It's a game that uses survival horror to tell a story about human beings, and really the imagery is completely secondary to that. To me, Silent Hill 2 is the peak of horror gameplay. Not because it makes me jump or because I'm afraid to play it with the lights off, but because I never want something like that to ever happen to me. And unlike Resident Evil or Dino Crisis, there's no real way to know that it won't. Considering just how dark and intense that was, let's turn to something a little more light-hearted. A series that I think never quite gets the recognition that it deserves is the Tony Hawk franchise. That's largely because the series began to tank in quality as we passed into the HD era, but also just because skateboard culture, at least the kind of which that these games are built on, isn't really a thing anymore. Despite my protestations, the age of Jackass and Viva La Bam, the X Games and alternative rock on the radio is well and truly over, and disappearing along with it is its holy emblem, the skateboard. It means that the series' massive cultural impact has been largely forgotten. And while it's recently had a bit of a resurgence with a pretty successful remake, I think many people don't realise just what a big deal this was for people in the 90s and 2000s. For those of us growing up away from the big cities, where bands never toured and where there weren't skate shops to hang out in or venues to play shows at, these games were a taste of a life that we only saw on TV. It was the closest we were ever going to get to skating around an abandoned warehouse or a mall after dark, and it really played a big role in the music we listened to, the clothes we wore, and the things that we wanted to do with our lives. Final Fantasy and Legend of Zelda might have sold many more copies, but when I bought clothes, I wanted to dress like Chad Musker and Bam Margera, and not Cloud Strife or Adult Link. Now, despite all that, being the little nerd that I was more into the games themselves than the aesthetics. And luckily for me, the Pro Skater series weren't just cultural touchstones. They were the fundamental blueprint for how to put together a damn fun extreme sports game. Neversoft's whole system of simulating tricks on a board really was pretty ingenious. Depending on if you were jumping or grinding, combinations of buttons would pull off different tricks, and learning which tricks comboed into each other had a really gamey logic to it, almost like learning the mechanics of a fighting game. With each installment, they added more tricks and more ways to extend your combo, which had the effect of turning Pro Skater into a series with a surprisingly high skill ceiling. In a funny way, it sort of paralleled how actual skateboarding worked, spending hours practicing something which has no real practical purpose, just so you can impress your friends. Anyway, as the franchise went from strength to strength, the development team at Neversoft got more and more ambitious, and by Pro Skater 4, the levels were huge, sprawling environments full of NPCs, with goals that functioned more like an adventure game than an arcade sports title. That progression from simple simulation to something more substantial eventually produced what might be the greatest sports game of all time, Tony Hawk's Underground, which truly broke new ground by combining all that skill-based skateboarding with the mechanics and narrative of an adventure RPG. It is still to this day one of my favourite games of all time, and an achievement in originality which is so often passed over when discussing the most influential games ever made. It would have been so easy for developer Neversoft to simply go the way of FIFA or the WWF games and churn out new titles every single year. But with Underground they really shot for the stars and tried to put together something crazy ambitious. It's the type of massive risk that we almost never see anymore, and it makes me admire it all the more. Instead of the arcade-style unconnected levels from the Pro Skater games, Underground delivered a full-fat story mode that told a surprisingly engaging rags-to-riches story. You make your own custom skater, and then along with your childhood friend, Eric Sparrow, you head out onto the streets of New Jersey to try and become a professional skater, trying to win competitions and sponsorships, getting into trouble and dealing with some twists and betrayals that are legitimately surprising. It takes all those nonsensical objectives from Pro Skater and reworks it into a system where your actions feel like they have purpose. Level high scores are now positioned as competitions to build reputation with sponsors, and objectives where you hit famous gaps or spots are done because you're trying to get in with local skaters. It's got absolutely everything the older Pro Skaters had, but dressed up in a way that feels like a cohesive experience. The biggest change of all was the ability to finally step off your board, which might sound completely pointless given the whole point of the game is to skate, but it actually adds a level of immersion which really can't be underestimated. Being able to walk up to NPCs that you want to talk to or climb to a specific spot doesn't sound like much, but it converts your player character from a rolling skatebot into what feels like an actual avatar. It's a tiny change, but it enables all of that adventure game atmosphere, and it's now impossible to imagine a skateboarding game where you can't just step off. Now that's all obviously pretty awesome, but what pushes Underground into all-time classic territory is the huge dose of RPG mechanics that now govern most of the game. Levels are full of side quests which, if you complete, you get points which you can invest in different skills like making grinding or manuals easier, or increasing the height of your jump or the speed of your tricks. That idea is an utter stroke of genius, and it means that along with narrative progression, we get a hefty dose of gameplay progression, slowly working to improve your skills and genuinely becoming a world-class skater by the end of the game. It's got that classic RPG satisfaction to it, and the fact that this system has been basically implemented in every single sports game since, from Forza to SSX to FIFA, really just shows how forward-thinking Neversoft really were being. It's an extreme sports game, but it's so much more. It's an adventure RPG with skill-based gameplay and an engaging story that doesn't feature a single weapon or fight or death. Just classic 2000s skateboarding vibes, put together by a studio that wanted to be more than it was. The Tony Hawk's franchise might not really be as much of a player as it used to be, and its cultural impact definitely has waned greatly. But I really think that developers can still learn a huge amount from Underground. People love stories, and people love ambition. And just because the genre you're making doesn't usually have those, well, it doesn't mean that you should shy away from trying to make something memorable that stands the test of time. If you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know that I'm a huge JRPG fan, and I think it's a genre which takes a lot of unfair criticism. It's been caricatured as a repetitive, annoying and dull style of game, and I think while a lot of modern JRPGs do stray dangerously close to that, if we head back to the 1990s, it really was a genre on the absolute cutting edge of video game presentation, narrative and design. One of my absolute favourites is Final Fantasy Tactics, and specifically the PSP remake, War of the Lions, that was released in 2007. In my view, it's the ultimate counter-argument to all those age-old criticisms, and desperately needs to be ported to modern systems so it can enjoy another wave of recognition. Final Fantasy Tactics was the brainchild of Yasumi Matsuno, who might be my all-time favourite game designer and writer, responsible for a host of incredible titles like Tactics Ogre, Vagrant Story, and Final Fantasy XII. Unlike every other JRPG creator, his games aren't nearly as magical or adventurous, generally being rooted in very real-world themes like politics, conspiracy, and class, featuring massive casts full of warring factions and nations. If you love George R.R. Martin's take on the fantasy genre, Matsuno's games should be right up your street, and in my opinion, Final Fantasy Tactics is the absolute pick of the bunch. Its plot is labyrinthine and complex, but to simplify it for this video, it revolves around the kingdom of Evilis, which is being torn asunder by civil war for the throne, which is devastating the land and its people. Our two main characters are Ramza and Deletia, childhood friends but from different sides of the social coin, with Ramza the son of a nobleman and Deletia a commoner. When the war tears them apart, we're thrust into a sprawling tale of grey morality, class warfare and intricate political intrigue, where betrayal lurks around every corner and bloodshed is a way of life. What makes all this so special is that it's devoid of the type of good and bad dynamics that usually govern the plots of JRPGs. And almost every character you fight has fleshed out reasons for being part of this war. It never strays into the preachy war is bad and evil is bad territory, and instead dwells somberly on the pain that warfare inflicts and humanity's inability to stop fighting each other. It's thought-provoking in a way that the Final Fantasy games rarely ever are, a million miles from the chosen ones and ultimate space evils that define the rest of the franchise. If you play games to experience engaging and memorable stories, there are almost none better than Final Fantasy Tactics. Now, as engrossing as all this dialogue and story can be, you'll spend the majority of your time fighting battles and customizing your party, and these two elements are just as captivating. Matsuno had been brought to Squaresoft specifically to make a strategy RPG, mainly thanks to his success developing Ogre Battle and Tactics Ogre for the Super Nintendo. And this game represents the perfect intersection of the complexity of those two games with the more accessible nature of its now parent series. Unlike the random battles and turn-based combat which are emblematic of 90s RPGs, Final Fantasy Tactics fights take place on larger battlegrounds, where careful positioning is just as important as the gear you equip or the spells you cast. Attacks from behind or above cause more damage, and things like elevation and line of sight are really important for ranged attacks or spells to hit their targets. It just immediately blows apart that age-old criticism that JRPG combat is boring or unrealistic, and reworks the formula into something that genuinely does look and work like a battlefield melee. That feeling of playing out more realistic conflict is heightened all the more by the inclusion of permadeath. That's right, the brutal reality of war isn't just found in the narrative, and charging blindly into ambushes or traps carries huge penalties. The whole system forces you to actually think tactically, protecting weaker spellcasters or setting up meat shields to keep away particularly dangerous foes. And certain levels feel like they were designed specifically to break your heart and tear away that monk you've been training for the past 50 hours. If it sounds intense, it absolutely is, and the game really doesn't fuck around, putting together some seriously challenging battles that you really need to think about before you charge in. It's not quite at the level of older Fire Emblem titles, where you essentially need to lose a battle before you can work out what to do. But levels like Door to Trade City or the Vigraph boss fight have a reputation as some of the hardest fights in the genre, and it's absolutely well deserved. Luckily though, customizing your party and exploring all the tools available to you is ridiculously fun, and grinding skills never becomes a chore thanks to the clever way that progression is handled. Tactics takes the job system from Final Fantasy V and allows you to craft your own unique party. Everyone starts as a squire or a chemist, and as you level them up, you unlock new classes like the knight, the wizard, or the priest. Where things get really interesting is that the higher tier jobs require multiple levels in multiple classes, and as every character can have 2 equipped at once, you'll be experimenting with crazy combinations all of the time, taking parts of one class and blending them with another to create hyper powerful units. Do you want a ninja that can cast time magic to attack multiple times a turn? A healer that wears a full suit of armour and can fight at the front line? Maybe a summoner who can use pistols from across the map? Hell, you can even unlock a Beastmaster class that recruits the monsters you fight to add a completely different Pokemon-esque dimension to your company. There's just so much depth to the combat system that despite the relatively slow pace of its battles, you'll want to get into fight after fight, crafting the perfect team and taking on the game's brutal challenges. Now, I mentioned earlier that my favourite version is the PSP re-release, and that's actually for quite a few different reasons. Firstly, as the base game never actually came out in PAL regions, I'd been tortured for years by forum posts and website articles talking about a game that I was sure I would love. When War of the Lions, the PSP remake, was announced in 2007, I worked like a dog at Pizza Hut in order to afford the system and then proceeded to sink about 200 hours into the game. So that version represents a long journey of longing, hard work, and then finally getting the satisfaction that I always thought I would. But it's not just personal bias that makes this the definitive version, as it really does have a huge amount of objective improvements. There are now beautifully animated cutscenes that play at crucial moments, extra characters to recruit, and most importantly of all, an all-new translation. You see, the original Final Fantasy Tactics might have the most notoriously bad localization of all time, and it gives the whole plot, which is already extremely complex, a really unwelcome dose of confusion. Huge amounts of detail were lost in the original, and the PSP version's main goal was to reintroduce all this lost context, and give the dialogue a flow that suits its dark medieval setting. It's not to everyone's taste, but I personally think it's fantastic. It reads like an adaptation of Shakespeare's Henry V, or some fantasy interpretation of the War of the Roses. It just feels like such an ambitious style to go for, and the fact that it actually lands it, telling a story of such scope with only the resources of the PlayStation 1 to work with, well, it's just surely one of the finest examples of the genre ever put together. Now, sadly, the game has never been ported to modern systems, which I think is an absolute crime, given it would be perfect for the Nintendo Switch or Steam Deck. If you're desperate, there is an Android and iOS version, but for me, the touchscreen controls always never quite feel right. And so for now, I'll be emulating it until Square Enix decides to pick up the money they're leaving on the table. As for its creator, well, Matsuno would follow up this masterpiece with 2 more unbelievably good RPGs, Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy XII, and then in 2005, he unfortunately fell ill and retired from full-time development. It's heavily suspected that his illness was related to the intense stress of directing big-budget games, which really is such a shame. The man had creative vision like nobody else, and the industry is absolutely worse off for his absence. He has since sort of returned, writing 2 scenarios for Final Fantasy XIV, the Return to Evilis and God Save the Queen raids, which are by all accounts fantastic. But I'd love for him to one day return to the director's seat and set his brilliant mind to crafting another JRPG that breaks all of those traditions that have become even more entrenched since he retired. A genre that we've never really touched on before is fighting games, which really for the longest time were the de facto multiplayer genre. Before first-person shooters and battle royales, the way you proved your gamer skill was either in the arcades or at home, doing battle with your friends over Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat or Tekken. Now, I've always really enjoyed a good fighting game and spent endless hours when I was a teenager perfecting combos in Marvel vs. Capcom or practicing my wave dashing in Super Smash Bros. Melee. But sadly, as I've gotten older, I've sort of fallen out of love with the genre. Maybe it's just that at my advanced age, I just don't have the patience to learn all those nuanced mechanics in order to feel like I can actually play the game properly. And increasingly I've found a lot of classic fighting game franchises have really prioritised Evo-influenced ranked play over comprehensive single-player modes. There is, however, one franchise that I've always stuck with, through thick and thin, from the moment it came out to the latest instalment, and that is Soul Calibur. Amazingly, I actually first saw it all the way back when it was known as Soul Blade, when I was about 10 years old at a friend's birthday party. Everyone was taking it in turns to pick a game to play, and while everyone else rotated between Spyro the Dragon, Crash Bandicoot and Tomb Raider, I was focused on this strange looking game that had a sort of mummy warrior on the front. Everybody else hated it, but being the little nerd that I was, the crazy fantasy setting and characters drew me in a way that Street Fighter and Tekken never really did. A few years later, the franchise would morph into Soul Calibur, renamed and now on the Dreamcast. Those rough edges from Soul Blade were filed down, and what we were left with is one of the best fighting game systems of all time. One that's equal parts accessible and complex, and which has provided me with countless hours of fun over the years. What makes the series so special is really that anyone can pick it up. The fundamentals really are quite basic. You can move around in 8 directions, and the face buttons each relate to a kick, a horizontal attack, a vertical attack, and a block. Each takes priority over another, and different sequential combinations produce different 3 or 4 hit combos, which means even the most basic attacks have a level of strategy behind them. Things get a little more flashy if you press 2 of the attack buttons together, and depending on the direction you're holding, this will activate one of 8 signature moves, which depending on the character you're playing as, do all sorts of different things. Some characters leap into huge lunges or power up extra strong attacks or even teleport around the arena. It's just balanced perfectly. The moves all look really cool, but they have a lot of depth for skilled players to take advantage of, and most importantly, they're not hard to pull off. I've really never understood why so many fighting games gate their interesting moves behind such mechanical complexity, because it just makes execution more important than decision making, which leads to games that require hours of practice before you can actually enjoy yourself. Soul Calibur goes in the total opposite direction. After just a brief bit of explanation, really anyone can dive into a few matches, and the huge combo chains, animation cancelling and character tier lists aren't a requirement to actually have fun. Now what makes the series really stand out, at least to my strange taste, is just how utterly crazy its plot and presentation are, and how shamelessly the developers, Project Soul and later Namco, lean into this insanity. The entire series is set in the 16th and later the 17th century and revolves around 2 sentient magical swords, the Evil Soul Edge and the Holy Soul Calibur, with all of our characters seeking to either possess or destroy them. Things get ludicrously convoluted over the course of the 6 main games, with various characters getting possessed by evil and then later redeemed, becoming vampires or accidentally killing their loved ones. Fighting games aren't exactly known for their concise storytelling, so Soul Calibur instead embraces it, with the series even having an unnamed, omniscient narrator who introduces every single match in the most utterly over-the-top way possible.
Watched over by the Almighty Ones, they unleash their fury.
Because the whole series is just an exploding glut of fantasy ideas, the rosters are also equally eclectic, and I think the sheer variety in the casts is one of the reasons that the series has remained so popular over the years. Unlike in other 3D fighters like Dead or Alive, Virtua Fighter, and even Tekken to a degree, every single character is completely unique, with their own distinct fighting style that's based on the weapon they wield. Of course, there are more cookie-cutter characters, like Sophitia the Greek warrior, Mitsurugi the samurai, or Raphael the duelist, but the real joy comes from playing the weirder characters that the warped minds at Project Soul have come up with. The obvious standout is the absolute lunacy that is Voldo, a blind, deaf and dumb bodyguard who somehow manages to fight like some kind of crazy sexual jester with a set of Wolverine claws. His moves are ridiculous, rolling up into a ball, running around like a crab, or literally just thrusting his crotch. I absolutely love it. He's always doing something super weird, and you can't help but find yourself wanting to play as this utterly unique character. Similarly, there's Siegfried and Nightmare that wield improbably massive swords, Maxi who fights at 500 miles per hour with nunchucks, Taki and Yoshimitsu who have access to magical attacks, Ivy with a whip sword and distinct distaste for clothing, and even characters like the pirate Cervantes who has a fully functional gun. There's also the guest characters, which are a pretty big part of the series. Every release has a pretty big name character from a different franchise, and they've always been really well executed. In Soul Calibur 2, we got to play as Link from Legend of Zelda. Soul Calibur 4 had Darth Vader and Yoda, 5 had Ezio from Assassin's Creed, and the latest title, Soul Calibur 6, featured Geralt of Rivia with a moveset full of potions, traps and signs. While they're usually not incorporated into the story, they're just great fun, and seeing Voldo fight against Yoda or Ezio Auditore assassinating a giant lizard man is a sort of bonkers fun that Soul Calibur does best. Really, I could pop in any one of the games and have fun playing it, which I think is a real testament to what a consistently fantastic series this is. Now I think whichever fighting game you hold dearest in your heart probably has a lot to do with the series that you've spent the most time with, and this is probably true for me in Soul Calibur, but I feel like that's happened because the games have always come out at what feels like the perfect time in my life. The first few released when I was a kid, overawed by the cast and the fantasy aesthetics. I'm really just happy to be fighting as a guy with a big sword, with the inclusion of Link as an added bonus to get my Nintendo fanboy heart pumping. As I grew up and started spending more time around friends' houses, we'd stay up all night playing Soul Calibur 3 and 4, forming little mini leagues and practicing our mains in an effort to become the top dog. Similarly, 5 came out when I was living away from home at university, with late nights fueled by beers and smoke, giving me some of the best memories of that part of my life. It took 6 years for the next release, and by that point, I was an adult. I had a proper job, a house, a girlfriend, a cat, but we all still got together to eat pizza and check out the newest game. It's not just a story of magical swords, it's a story of my own life. And whenever I sit down to play a game, I'm back in all those moments at once, and that's absolutely something worth holding on to. So to end this video, we're going to do probably the most punk rock thing a long format YouTube channel can do, and that's talk about an Elder Scrolls game in a reasonable amount of time. So that being said, what's really left to say about Morrowind that hasn't been said in a more eloquent or detailed or emotive way elsewhere? And the answer is really nothing. So in the most liberating way possible, this is just going to be me talking about what makes this game special, and I'll leave those detailed breakdowns to others. In my opinion, a big part of what makes Morrowind stand the test of time and remain so beloved by its fans is that Bethesda never really made another game like it, and while it absolutely paved the way for the massive mainstream success they enjoy today, it was arguably a bit of an evolutionary dead end for them. Now let me explain. When compared to its sequels, huge parts of the core design philosophy that made Morrowind the acclaimed game that it is weren't actually carried over. If we compare the fundamental ideas that make Oblivion a great game with what makes Morrowind tick, you'll find two pretty different experiences that really only share a perspective. Oblivion is based around creating a superhero, a character with a broad range of skills who's perfectly balanced against the world at all times, and this has been done so that you can experience all of the game's many extremely well-crafted quests. It's a theme park with no queues, where the only thing preventing you from having a good time is the walk over to the ride. That's also reflected in the game's story, which is as close to a fantasy blockbuster as is possible to write. You're a prophesied hero, serving in the Emperor's secret service against a horde of demons pouring through portals to hell. The Oblivion subtitle isn't some metaphor, it's a literal description of the foes you're up against, and it's suitably fitting for an excellent, but ever so upfront game. Morrowind, on the other hand, well, it really doesn't share any of those characteristics. It's an extremely slow-paced and complex game, one where you really have to pick and stick to a build if you want to be able to make progress through the game's main quests. Some guilds might be completely inaccessible if you don't have the right skills, with the Mages Guild obviously not willing to let someone who can't actually use magic into their club. Weapons need to be skilled before you can use them, basic enemies can easily kill you, and even something as simple as making money requires forethought and planning. The world itself isn't inviting, but is instead hostile. There are areas you simply can't go to until you're strong enough, and the very quest system itself that the entire game is built on top of eschews quest markers and fast travel in favour of lengthy immersive journeys off into the wilderness, where you have to follow directions and maybe get lost. It's that immersion that's really the main appeal of Morrowind. It's not a game you play to be thrilled, it's a game you load up because you want to disappear into another universe. One filled with interesting and original world building, reams of history and culture that directly link into the actions that you undertake, and gameplay systems that encourage role-playing over Superman heroics. Considering that Skyrim would push the Elder Scrolls even further in the direction Oblivion broke to, it's had that effect of really cementing Morrowind's place in the series. It's often said that people simply love this game for nostalgia's sake, but that's just not true. It offers something that Bethesda almost immediately moved away from, and if you're looking for an RPG that's focused entirely on creative storytelling, immersive world building, and a really unique take on the fantasy genre, well, there's very few games that can match up to Morrowind, even 20 years later. Where Oblivion and Skyrim opted for the extremely familiar settings of traditional European fantasy and Game of Thrones inspired Nordic mythology, Morrowind instead heads off in its own direction, and thanks to that, it still feels as fresh as it did in 2002. It's a world where mushrooms tower over roads like trees, where people travel the continent in giant insects, and where areas of the land feel as distinct and diverse as any real-world location. Northern towns reside within giant crustacean shells. Capital cities formed of giant pyramids or clockwork citadels house god kings that you can physically speak to, and the very centre of the island is dominated by the volcanic and sick ashlands, resting atop ancient and shadowy ruins that speak of a dark past. It's a setting like no other, and Bethesda's creativity didn't stop at the design of the world, which seeps into every single corner of the game's narrative. From the moment you step out onto the dock at Seyda-Neen, your ideas of what is good and what is evil, who's to be trusted and why you should be doing the things you are, is frequently challenged, and conflicting viewpoints of important events are constantly presented to you. At the time of this Elder Scrolls game, Morrowind is a province of the Empire of Uriel Septim, and depending on who you speak to, it's either a boot on the neck of the Dunmer natives, or a reforming power washing away the old traditions that brought the nation to its knees. Nothing is cut and dry, and even within the Dunmer houses that want to resist the Empire, there exists cultural differences and ancient rivalries, all which you need to maneuver around as you work out your role in this chaotic world. Even the main quest, which in every other Elder Scrolls game is broadly speaking just a vehicle for huge set pieces, is memorable here because it constantly undermines that hero power fantasy. When you contract the lethal corpus disease and complete a quest to heal yourself with an experimental cure, is this happening because you're the resurrection of a prophesied hero who's immune to the sickness? Or is it happening because your benefactors are manipulating you into appearing like him? There's a reason that people still discuss and argue over Morrowind lore to this day, and it's because, frankly, Bethesda did an incredible job of fleshing out this world in meaningful ways, most of which directly relate to the things you see and do in the game. It's probably the only example of an RPG where reading the books and scrolls that usually just serve as window dressing actually fundamentally increases your understanding of what's happening in the game's narrative. Key information like the history of corpus sickness, the events that led to the nation's conquest, or even the backstory of key characters is all found within these books, and they're not just there to create a fake sense of depth, but to serve an actual immersive purpose. Now, this might be a surprising take, but something that I think makes all this complex and deep lore really work is the lack of voice acting. As almost every single NPC only has at most 2 or 3 voiced lines, the vast majority of dialogue and conversation is done via traditional text, which means that virtually every single topic in the game is wildly more detailed than in any subsequent title. NPCs are veritable libraries of information, and this leads to even minor characters having really fleshed out backstories which justify their side quests or allegiances. The old criticism of this has always been silent characters are unrealistic and reading damages my immersion, which I've always found to be ludicrous. In Bethesda's very next game, they would ditch this level of detailed writing in favour of every NPC being fully voiced, which in my view had the effect of utterly destroying the believability of the world of Tamriel. Minor characters in Oblivion and Skyrim have maybe 3 or 4 things to say in total, and thanks to the huge cost associated with producing that amount of voice work, we've got a tiny cast that repeats constantly. In giving voice to the citizens of Cyrodiil and Skyrim, they were essentially stripped of any character that they had, and opportunities for snippets of lore or compelling backstories had to be removed along with it. Really, there's just so much to talk about that I can't possibly say everything that I want to, and it's probably why this is one of the most heavily covered games on YouTube. The lore is worth hundreds of analysis videos, the gameplay is perfect for challenge runs or unique builds, and as it runs on just about any machine going, it's no surprise that it's just as popular now as it was when it originally released. There might be nothing new left to say about Morrowind, but it doesn't mean speaking about it is meaningless. With every year that an older, beloved game ages, it becomes easier for its critics to dismiss that praise as nostalgia, or to claim things have moved on. But Morrowind still offers an RPG experience like no others, and one that's actually becoming increasingly rare. A world designed to be explored and discovered, not just create moments of memorable gameplay. It's the quintessential essence of role-playing, and if things have moved on from that, well, you can count me out.
Not now, Dunmer, I'm busy.
And with that, we arrive at the end of our first Quickfire retrospective. Like I said at the top of the video, this is really just a space for me to talk about games that I find interesting or meaningful, but don't really fit into our regular scheduled programming. The next video is going to be a huge entire franchise retrospective, and on a series that absolutely doesn't get the love it deserves on this platform, so I'm really excited to share that as soon as it's finished. I'd also really like to know what you thought of this as a new series, and if you're interested to hear more about other classic or important games. I had a lot of fun working on this, and it's nice to be able to release videos slightly more often than normal, so let me know what you think down in the comments, which I will of course always try my best to reply to. In the meantime, if you want to support the channel and stay in touch, you can always support me through Patreon, and the link is in the description, although as ever, there's no pressure, but every penny does go back into the channel. So yeah, thanks for watching, I'll see you on the next one.